So I did my undergraduate research fellowship under Dr. Catherine Beebe and with my colleague Brooke. I did mine over spirituality in the Middle Ages, and I titled it Mapping Observance, Travel, and Spirituality in the Late Middle Ages. So here's my abstract. Our research mentor gave us an amazing opportunity to be a part of her long-term project. The data she allowed us to view identified Dominican convents in parts of the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, and France. It also identified when those convents chose to accept the Observant Reformation, which occurred during the 15th century. I chose to do my specific research project over the spiritual practice that began to occur more frequently during this time, called imagined pilgrimage. I argue in this paper that the Observant Reformation caused the Dominican nuns to prefer to practice imagined pilgrimages over physical pilgrimages like their predecessors. I break my paper into 7 parts and
Did you lose connection?
For physical pilgrimages, I use 2 examples to showcase how physical travel guides were written and practiced. Then I will go on to imagined pilgrimages and how they are practiced. To conclude the whole paper, I will showcase the importance of both practices for medieval people and for us as scholars. All right, so life for women. Life for women, both lay and religious, was extremely difficult and lacked opportunities for anything to occur. As a whole, women were seen as inferior to men in all social, political, and economic spheres. Their whole gender was considered more sinful than men, and their lives were completely dictated by their relationship with men. They were also seen as a group that needed male guidance to function properly. Lay women especially had little opportunities to become literate and to regain control over their lives. A way to gain opportunities for themselves was to join a religious convent, ironically. Religious women in convents had better opportunities to become literate and have more autonomy over their lives. Women in these convents were supervised by religious men. However, these women soon began to create their own social values and rules. They even began to write for themselves and other women. In general, women were seen as inactive participants in the male-dominated medieval society. However, for this paper, I think it is very important to note that these women were just like us, active, intelligent, and dynamic in their social behavior. They affected the environment the only way they knew how to, and even though that is different than how we affect our current environment, we must not project our current historical context onto them, but use their own historical context to assess how they affect their environment. Now on to the Observant Reformation. The Observant Reformation was a popular movement that peaked before the Protestant Reformation. It called for a return to fundamental values such as stricter observances of the rules in the Christian tradition. For religious women, this specifically meant stricter enclosures of their convents. The Dominican order mostly did not view these new stricter rules as hindrances, but instead as aids to their devotion. Some women objected to these new rules, but they soon left these convents for others who did not accept the reform. For the nuns, the Observant Reformation largely impacted their physical movement. These women were no longer allowed to leave their convents, and thus physical pilgrimages were no longer a viable source to gain indulgences, which in their Christian tradition was very important to them. Now, what is a physical pilgrimage? Physical pilgrimages are defined as the physical act of traveling to a religious site, such as the Holy Land or Rome, for religious reasons. These religious benefits or reasons were called indulgences, and they were tickets a person could acquire from themselves or others on these trips. These tickets limited the amount of time a person spent in purgatory, thus allowed a person to go to gain access to heaven quicker. Physical pilgrimages required a large amount of freedom to perform them. Thus, women in general often were not able to perform them. I used 2 examples in my paper to show how these travels were written down and how they affected those who read them. I used Felix Fabry's travel logs of 1480 through 1483 and the Guidebook to Palestine, which was written earlier in 1350 CE. Both are written in different styles, however, both were used to help others go on the same journeys. Fabry's travel logs were written like a story. Many narrative style components were in it, and thus was meant to fully envelop the reader during the telling of its story. while the guidebook to Palestine is written in a more methodical fashion, and it was supposed to be used as a literal map to the Holy City. Many people did not perform these travels because they were so dangerous, even though they were still popular. Travelers still had to watch out for environmental dangers, disease, and even other people. However, these travels not only provided for those who physically took them, but also who chose to read about them. These travel logs that were written down would not only be used to recreate the same travels physically for those men, but women would soon use them for their spiritual travels. Now, what is a spiritual travel? Spiritual travel, or imagined pilgrimages, differed from physical pilgrimages by the very nature of their process. To perform these journeys, a nun would have to imagine and or spiritually put themselves in the Holy Land or Rome. To do that, they would have to visualize the area, say specific prayers, meditate, and surround themselves with relics of religious value. These journeys can be characterized by the blurring of active and inactive participation on the nun's part. Instead of just reading about the travels through the physical pilgrimage travel logs, they instead would become active participants in these stories. These stories now included them as the main characters. All the senses were used in these journeys just like they would be in a physical one. However, sight was especially important to the nuns. Viewing these logs, manuscripts, and relics were vital to transporting the nuns to their destination. They had to physically, mentally, and spiritually feel these journeys, whether these journeys were about the birth of Christ or the death. These pilgrimages were conducted in the safety of their convents. However, there were still dangers associated with this kind of travel. These dangers were both mental and physical. The toll of these journeys could physically affect the bodies as well as their mental health. These journeys had to be prepared for and were not frivolous trips women would just go on, but instead were serious commitments they had to make. Finally, the importance of both of these travels. Each form of travel was important in their own right. These forms of travel were not separate from one another, but instead relied on each other to function. Without physical pilgrimages and the literature associated with them, women would not have a basis to begin writing their own. The interaction between the two show how important the Observant Reformation was for women and their scholarship. We can see through the imagined pilgrimage that the importance of women the importance of women on the larger medieval society. Through this practice, we are given more voices to learn from during this time. Overall, we are able to better understand the larger picture of medieval society. Through my research, I have come to understand the importance of the Observant Reformation and its effect on religious medieval landscape, which is very important to us as a scholarship or a academic community because there's not many voices to hear from during this time. So the more voices we gather, the larger picture we can create, and thus the more accurate and clearer it becomes.
This essay will explore the perceptions of the spirit and body in addition to the activities undertaken by convents under perpetual enclosure, with a short history of the observance movement for the uninitiated. The observant religious reform movement, which swept through Germany during the 14th and 15th centuries, encouraged a return to religious roots for the clergy. It was not a completely homogeneous movement, with different levels of religious involvement between houses, but most houses shared some similar facets. These included the embrace of poverty, the lack of personal property, and the enclosure of convents to ensure the spirituality of those enclosed remained unaffected by outside matters. Especially within all female religious institutions, enclosure aimed to minimize access to and interaction with the sinful outside world by blocking those inside from seeing out or being seen from within. It was not always a happily agreed upon term of reform. Many opposed the idea of enclosure, but ultimately the observant reform won out among many cloisters as there was little remaining literature from those who shunned enclosure and much from those who supported it. Though popular and having produced some of the most well-known religious figures of all time, observant reform had a rocky existence, which led partly to the harsh conditions of enclosure. Sisters of the convent shown in Steinbach, likely the most celebrated observant convent in the first in a German-speaking area, noted by the contemporary chronicler Johannes Meyer, still had to be pushed into reforming. Though this was not the case with every convent, it was not uncommon. Observant enclosure was put into the word of canon law in 1298 in the papal bull issued, called Periculoso, by Pope Boniface VIII, which stated that nunneries from that point on would be put under strict segregation from the eyes of others. From that point, iron bars were constructed around the convent, including on its windows, making the nuns inside imperceptible to anyone looking in. Goods were handed to nuns through chutes by those on the outside. Any speaking done with outsiders would have been done through an iron grate. The convent was blocked away from the rest of the church so that nuns could not be seen during services. When necessary, they could be visited by an abbess or other religious official who held one of the few keys to the convent. Male writers of the observant movement included voices such as Johannes Meyer, who was adamantly in favor of enclosure. Dominican clergy such as himself tended to be more ardent supporters of observant reform and the chastity and separation of the female body from the outside world. Meyer and his contemporary Johannes Nieder, while both in the reform mindset, held the bodies of women in lower regard as vessels of piety. Still, they helped convents reform and remain a valuable source in studying the importance of women in the movement. Monks were not the only supporters, however. Plenty of prioresses and nuns themselves wanted reform in order to increase their connection and devotion to God. Many women were ready to lay down a normal way of life in favor of poverty and strict devotion. In addition, there were plenty of prominent female sponsors of the reform movement, who acted as patrons helping to build new convents. In a movement based on poverty, some observant houses needed the monetary support and goods from these sponsors to continue existing. Poverty was a facet of observance that went hand in hand with enclosure and also experienced some pushback from convents which were to be reformed. Many devout readily gave up their belongings to their institutions, while retaining a few of their basic luxury. Not every sister was extremely willing to give away all earthly possessions and survive only by donations. Complaints about voluntary poverty included the argument that the money would be stripped from nuns' possessions and put into the hands of some wealthy abbess to do as they wanted with. Many nuns, however, fell somewhere in between, indecisive about whether or not to embrace poverty alongside perpetual enclosure to further their spirituality. However, those who were on the fence had women to look towards, such as Magdalena Butler, a reformist who grew up wealthy but readily accepted the voluntary poverty of observance. For whatever reason, those who did not wish to reform often resisted it violently. The convent of St. Catherine in Colmar apparently resisted so raucously that some of the male reformers there feared for their lives. Much of these women's fears would have been around the state of perpetual enclosure, but the complete loss of one's material possessions also pressed some sisters to behave erratically in the face of reform. As mentioned previously, some convents ended up being quite wealthy. For example, take St. Catherine's in Augsburg. Even these convents had trouble converting, and never really experienced true poverty. Still, the sisters went so far as to tear down the iron bars holding them in, and to attack the workmen constructing them. Though it converted to observance in name, it was enforced weekly. So was the case with some other observant institutions, as some communities could never completely rally behind strict enclosure. It is known that sisters from less observant houses who aspired to a more observant lifestyle left St. Catherine's in favor of Schonensteinbach, renowned for its strict adherence to reform. The female body was seen as a unique spiritual form, capable of pure holiness but also easily corruptible by sin. The most notable male authors contemporary to the movement wrote that the female body was less effective for purposes of worship than the male. Because of this widespread belief, reformers are often strict on their own bodies, inflicting self-punishment to remedy perceived wrongdoings and practicing asceticism to the highest degree. The physical body was devalued, and ailments were often seen as positive signs from God. Sickness in particular was seen as a gift, as a diminished bodily form was viewed as bringing one closer to heaven. Having already gone through the loss of material possession, some women decided that the body too was a material possession getting in the way of their communion with God. Thus the spirit was seen as being more important. However, because of enclosure, the nuns' spiritual needs could not be taken care of properly. They could not make the journey to the 7 pilgrim churches of Rome. Instead, nuns sometimes took up imagined pilgrimage, in which they would make long journeys to Rome in their minds. The Sisters of St. Catherine's in Augsburg had been specially granted the indulgences which would have been given to one who had already visited the 7 churches of Rome, although they would never actually set foot outside of their enclosed homes. Through virtual pilgrimage, nuns were finally able to make the spiritual journey to sacred places. It was not done without physical movement. To emulate the feeling of a journey, spots would have been designated within a convent for the sisters to move through while making their pilgrimage. This is an example of the body being used not just as a spiritual vessel, but also as a tool of worship, not completely devalued. The physical body as a spiritual tool was not only used in virtual pilgrimage. Male reformers critical of the female capacity to worship were worried about the capability of the female body to practice dark arts. However, there were plenty of convents who produced works which stated otherwise. The Vitae of the Sisters of St. Catherine Entel and Diessenhofen were prominent manuscript writers, and their experiences reflect the capacity of the physical body to reflect piety. A notable episode within the Vitae is one in which a sister appears glowing and translucent to the sisters around her, levitating and crystalline. The sister in question was known for her strict obedience to observance. The event is an example of the female body being physically displayed as a pure form, and that the sisters witnessing this were also encouraged to behave similarly to the one who appeared glowing, in hopes of attaining such gifts of piety. Another part of the same manuscript has a sister see the translucent image of St. Catherine feeding a sick nun in the infirmary. Such physical concepts of food and nourishing the sick suggest that nuns were capable of the highest level of piety under enclosure. With no access to the world outside of their convents, enclosed nuns found ways to spend their infinite time at home. Many Reformed convents took up manuscript writing or artwork. Many Dominican nunneries amassed libraries of books written by the women who lived there, as well as books imported from other authors. A fair amount of the books produced in enclosed convents were about the inhabitants of those convents. For example, the St. Catherine Entel Sister book, or the Magdalene book produced about the aforementioned reformer Magdalene Butler. Works written about other observant women were a popular subject, as well as holy manuscripts, histories, and records. Strictly observant convents tended to amass much larger libraries of books, both self-written and imported, than those who were not. Artwork, too, became a popular activity within enclosed convents. Visual aids to crucifixes furthered devotion by engaging the viewer on the emotional level, as one viewing Jesus on the cross would be more inclined to feeling. Imagery within devotional manuals shows the high place of artwork within convents, as the necessity of illustration eclipsed writing, another highly devotional activity. The observant reform movement of the 14th and 15th centuries was not an altogether cohesive movement, but nonetheless swept through most of the monasteries in southern Germany. It advocated for a return to the ascetic way of life that monks and nuns long before had followed. Its tenets included those such as voluntary poverty, asceticism, intense spirituality, and especially for women's convents, enclosure. Complete enclosure separated nuns from the outside world in a bid to keep them from being corrupted by outside forces and to increase their spirituality by keeping their convents with other women who would hold them spiritually accountable. Enclosure had an effect on the way these women led their lives, from the way they practiced spirituality, to the perception of their own physical body, and to the activities undergone within their infinite time within the convent walls. Thank you.
Yay. Congratulations. Well, I'm going to start with the questions, just because I can, because I'm the moderator. And then we'll see if the two of you have questions for each other, or if our audience has questions. So, Sarah, I'm going to start with you. Your paper, your presentation, really sounds like a women's solidarity movement. I know you're talking about nuns, but it still sounds like some form of women's solidarity. Is that an accurate perception on my part?
I would say so in a form, because during this time, other women were still able to view these women in these convents and see what was happening. And although this reform movement was very restrictive, they were still learning and hearing about the activities these women were doing. And like Brooke said, lay women would take up religious convent or go to religious convents as well. And so I do think, in a way, this movement helped female solidarity come about in the medieval ages, especially in the 15th century.
Okay, and I sort of have a question for both of you, but this one is for you, Sarah, specifically. Where did these women, these nuns, get the money, I suppose? And I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask anyway. Where did they get the money for the travels that they did?
Well, Because they were still moderated by religious men officials like abbots. They were really the ones who funded these convents. Some religious women, some religious outside women who weren't in convents, who were on the richer side, would still give money to these convents just for their piety and their observances. So you can see it in both outside sources and inside sources that gave money to these women.
All right. Okay, so now to Brooke. Brooke, I had to chuckle. You didn't hear it because my microphone was muted. But as I was following along with your paper, you talked about how men thought that women were more corruptible. Um, to me, that's just hilarious. But do you, in your research, did you run across anything that indicated that men realized that nuns were more compassionate or more nurturing to parishioners? And do you think that these men looked at women as a threat to their power?
Well, in one of the chroniclers that I mentioned, Johannes Meyer, he actually does mention that women are capable of being like a pure holy form under the right circumstances, in which those circumstances are observance. So there are men who did believe that women were capable of being more nurturing and more pious than men under certain circumstances. And you had another question as well, right? Could you repeat that?
Well, it was just, did men see women as a threat to their power?
I think more than to their own power, they saw women as a threat to religious structure, if that makes sense. Which is why enclosure was such a big phenomenon, was because women were so corruptible to the church structure, keeping them inside a convent would keep them from causing any trouble.
So you all have written two very good papers, but to me have almost diametrically opposing arguments. And that is, Serra, you wrote about women traveling and recording their travels for, and either whether or not they did it intentionally, which I think they did, but their travels and their recordings influenced other women, some nuns and some who were just religious. And then, Brooke, you talked about this strict enclosure movement of keeping women basically imprisoned in a convent. So how do the two of you reconcile those attitudes, I suppose, by men who would allow women to travel on one hand, but then put them behind metal grills in a convent on the other hand?
Well, something that I came across a lot while I was reading was while most nuns in convents were not allowed to leave, you could be granted leave from the convent to convert, or under really special circumstances to go on pilgrimages. But for those who weren't able to get that kind of grant, they would practice pilgrimage at within their convent.
Serra?
I think both of our papers are the same side of the coin in a way. you see the female solidarity within the convents, but you also see that it's a strict observant reformation. Women were, rights were taken away. I think it really boils down to women creating their own space within the roles that they're given. So even though that they did not have a lot of opportunities and freedoms to perform things that they might have wanted to do, they still made a space for themselves within this movement.
Fantastic answer. Both of you, good answers. I sort of liken this to women in the United States in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. It was called the cult of domesticity. And so you had a rise of middle-class women who didn't really have any power, but they got together and they created magazines for other women. And they shared recipes about meals with other women. And so obviously those are several centuries apart, but I think the concept of this women's solidarity is the same. So we have 3 audience members and we have our host, Serra. Do you all have any questions? Serra, can we unmute everyone and see if anyone has any questions, or you can type a question in the chat room. And Brooke and Serra, do you have any questions for each other?
I don't have any questions, but I did want to congratulate Serra on doing an amazing job. I really liked what you did with your paper.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your paper. I think it's very important, like the same side of the coin. It's important to see both sides of this movement, and I think together we created a great research project.
I believe so.
So does our audience have any questions?
I don't.
Okay.
Congratulations on great papers.
Thank you.
Well, if the audience doesn't have any questions, I have one more for both of you. So where do you go from here with these papers and the topic?
Well, together we're still working on putting a bigger project together with Dr. Beebe. We're going to be doing some work mapping these convents into a database for other students to use afterwards.
Fantastic. Is there anything to add?
I think to go forward, publishing these papers to get them into the discourse, because there are a lot of resources, but at the same time it's very slim of the research in this area, because the Observant Reformation, in my opinion, was looked over. So publishing these papers, I think, are very important to get into the discourse, and that's what's in our future.
Fantastic. Well, be sure to thank Dr. Beebe for her guidance. I was reading along as you were presenting, following your PowerPoint, Serra. We don't have enough history about women, period. It doesn't really matter the time that we're talking about. We just don't have enough history about women's experiences in whatever society. So keep the faith and fight the fight. As I tell my daughter, fight the man. Ladies, wonderful job. This is always the highlight of any event that I get to take part in, and that is listening to students talk about their research. You all exhibit passion and energy, and that just makes professors happy and pleased.